Chapter 1. Introduction. Why Ancient Greece is Still Formative Today. Imagine a world where philosophers discuss justice in marketplaces, poets sang heroic epics, and people in white robes performed theater in the open air. A world in which city-states struggled for power and influence, in which myths of Zeus, Athena, or Poseidon determined everyday life, and in which a form of democracy developed for the first time in the history of mankind. This world is ancient Greece. When we talk about the West today, democracy, science, philosophy, theater, or sport, there is almost always a common thread leading back to it. Ancient Greece is considered one of the most important cradles of our civilization. It was not the only one, and much of it is also based on older cultures such as Egypt, Mesopotamia, or Persia. But the Greeks created something that was unique, a combination of myth and reason, of art and politics, of war and culture, which still shapes our thinking today. So why is it worth telling the story of ancient Greece? Quite simply, because we find ourselves in it. If we want to understand why we see plays on stage, why we have parliaments, why we cheer in sports stadiums, or why we think about philosophy, then we have to go back to the beginnings, to the land between the Aegean, the Ionian Sea, and the Mediterranean. But Greece was not a country as we know it today. Not a nation-state with clear borders, but a patchwork of city-states, islands, and colonies, connected by language, religion, and a certain cultural self-confidence, but often at odds and in competition with each other. This diversity made ancient Greece so exciting and so dynamic. The fascination of ancient Greece. The history of ancient Greece is more than a succession of battles and kings. It is a panorama of human experiences. Politics. This is where the idea of democracy was born, initially in Athens, a form of government that gave people the right to have a say in their fate. Although it was reserved for only a minority, the basic idea continues to have an effect today. Philosophy. Names like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle stand for a new way of thinking. They asked questions that we still ask ourselves today. What is truth? What is justice? What is a good life? Science. Mathematicians such as Pythagoras or astronomers such as Aristarchus produced findings that influenced the world into modern times. Art and architecture. From the harmonious proportions of temples to the dramas of Sophocles, the Greeks created an aesthetic that became a benchmark. Sports. With the Olympic Games, they established a festival that is still a symbol of peaceful competition today. But the fascination also lies in the contradictions. Ancient Greece was a place of great ideas, and at the same time marked by slavery, wars, and internal conflicts. Athens, the cradle of democracy, itself kept thousands of people in bondage. Sparta, famous for its discipline, was based on the oppression of an entire stratum of the population. And the Hellenic world was repeatedly marked by rivalry and bloody wars. Why we still need the story today? One might ask, why are we still dealing with this time more than 2,000 years later? Why not just modern history? The answer lies in continuity. Europe, indeed the entire Western world, is hardly conceivable without Greece. Roman culture was based on Greece. The Renaissance took up the writings of the philosophers. The Enlightenment adopted Greek ideas of freedom and reason. Even today, politicians, scientists, and artists quote the ancient Greeks, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. When we look at ancient Greece, we look into a mirror, so to speak. We recognize how old our questions are and how long people have been looking for answers. The common thread of our journey. So that we don't get lost in the abundance of events, myths, and names, we divide the story into chapters, similar to a great journey through the past. We start with the beginnings of the Mycenaean culture and the so-called Dark Centuries, a time in which many new things emerged. We move on to the development of the polis, that is, the city-states such as Athens and Sparta, and look at how these special political and social structures shaped the Greek world. We will look at religion and the myths that governed people's thinking, and see how art, architecture, and literature evolved from them. We accompany the Greeks through the Persian Wars, experience the Golden Age of Athens, but also the devastating Peloponnesian War which shook the classical world. Later, we turn to the rise of Macedonia, which changed the world with Philip II and Alexander the Great. We look at the Hellenistic period, in which Greek culture spread across the entire Mediterranean region deep into Asia. Finally, we take a look at Greece under Roman rule and ask at the end what legacy this era has left behind to this day. What to expect? This script is not a dry string of years. It is a tale of gods and heroes, of peasants and kings, of poets and warriors. We will ask ourselves, why did the Greeks build such magnificent temples even though they lived in constant war? What made Sparta so unique and at the same time so cruel? How could a small polis like Athens become the center of culture? Why did Alexander the Great inspire his soldiers to march to the borders of India? And what does all this have to do with our lives today? There will be moments when we will be amazed, for example, at the audacity with which the Greeks won against overpowering Persians. And there will be moments when we are shocked, for example, when we look at the atrocities of the Peloponnesian War or the harshness of the Spartan system. It is precisely this tension between splendor and misery, between idea and reality, that makes ancient Greece a thing that still fascinates us today. In the next chapter, we dedicate ourselves to the beginnings of Greek culture, the Mycenaean palaces, the heroes of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the dark centuries that followed. Because here, too, it is clear that Greece has been a country full of secrets and turning points from the very beginning. Chapter 2. The Beginnings, Mycenaean Culture, and Dark Centuries. Before Athens developed its democracy, before Sparta educated its warriors, and before philosophers thought about the nature of the world, there was already another advanced civilization in Greece, the Mycenaean world. It originated in the 2nd millennium BC and is considered the first great civilization on the Greek mainland. Their palaces, their weapons, their art, all this shows us that Greece produced a fascinating, independent culture early on. And yet this heyday ended in a collapse that plunged the country into a dark epoch for centuries. The Mycenaean culture, Greece's first glory. The Mycenaeans, named after the city of Mycenae in the Peloponnese, were not the only ones in the Aegean. At the same time, the Minoans lived in Crete, famous for their palaces like in Knossos and for their frescoes full of colors and joie de vivre. But while the Minoans tended to focus on trade and art, the Mycenaeans were more focused on war, power, and expansion from the beginning. The Mycenaean culture flourished from about 1600 to 1200 BC and left traces that we still know today. In Mycenae itself, you can still see the so-called Lion's Gate, the monumental entrance to the fortress, above which 2 stone lions are enthroned. The famous dome tombs, such as the Treasury of Atreus, also bear witness to the wealth and architecture of this time. The Mycenaeans were masters of fortress architecture. Their cities were mostly located on hills, surrounded by huge walls, which were called Cyclopean because it was believed that only giants could have built them. Inside these fortresses were palaces that were not only the residences of the rulers, but also administrative centers, granaries, and religious places. Heroes and warriors. The Mycenaeans were a warlike people. They led chariots, wore bronze armor, and fought with spears and swords. Their warrior elite formed the backbone of society. Early on, they developed a culture that valued fame and honor in war. Many stories that Homer later wrote down in the Iliad and Odyssey are probably rooted in the Mycenaean world. The Trojan War, whether historical or mythical, takes place in the late 13th century BC, exactly in the era of the Mycenaeans. Figures like Agamemnon, Achilles, or Odysseus may be literary heroes, but they reflect a society in which warlords, heroism, and divine destinies were closely linked. Trade and connections. But the Mycenaeans were not only warriors, but also traders and seafarers. They traveled far beyond the Aegean, as far as Asia Minor, Cyprus, Egypt, and perhaps even as far as Italy and Spain. Finds of Mycenaean pottery in distant ports prove that they had an extensive trade network. At the same time, they were in close contact with the Minoans. There are many indications that the Mycenaeans took over the Aegean Sea towards the end, after the Minoan culture had been weakened by natural disasters and possibly by Mycenaean conquests. The sudden collapse. Around 1200 BC, something happened that still occupies archaeologists today. The Mycenaean culture collapsed. Palaces were destroyed, cities abandoned, trade collapsed. What had happened? There are many theories. Some suspect natural disasters, earthquakes or droughts. Others see enemy attacks as the cause, for example by the mysterious sea peoples who shook entire empires in the eastern Mediterranean. Still others point to internal conflicts, uprisings, or economic crises. It was probably a mixture of several factors. Whatever happened, Greece sank into a phase that was later called the Dark Ages. The Dark Centuries, Regression and New Beginning. From about 1100 to 800 BC, we know little about what happened in Greece. Written sources are almost completely absent, and archaeological finds are also sparse. Cities fell into disrepair, art was simpler, trade was severely restricted. Many regions lived again almost as in tribal communities. Society was organized on a smaller scale. Palaces disappeared, and with them the power of great rulers. Instead, smaller communities came to the fore. But out of this apparent darkness, something new also grew. During this time, the Greeks became acquainted with iron, which gradually replaced expensive bronze. Iron made it easier to manufacture weapons and tools, a step that led to new developments in the long term. Homer and the memory of the heroic age. Although the dark centuries were marked by decline, it was also here that the basis for the cultural memory of the Greeks was created. Poets such as Homer, who may have lived in the 8th century BC, collected and handed down stories from the Mycenaean period. The Trojan War, the Odysseys of Odysseus. These epics were not only recited for entertainment, but they formed the identity of the Greeks. They told of a heroic past in which honor, bravery, and divine destinies were closely linked. Trade and connections. But the Mycenaeans were not only warriors, but also traders and seafarers. They traveled far beyond the Aegean, as far as Asia Minor, Cyprus, Egypt, and perhaps even as far as Italy and Spain. Finds of Mycenaean pottery in distant ports prove that they had an extensive trade network. At the same time, they were in close contact with the Minoans. There are many indications that the Mycenaeans took over the Aegean Sea towards the end, after the Minoan culture had been weakened by natural disasters and possibly by Mycenaean conquests. The sudden collapse. Around 1200 BC, something happened that still occupies archaeologists today. The Mycenaean culture collapsed. Palaces were destroyed, cities abandoned, trade collapsed. What had happened? There are many theories. Some suspect natural disasters, earthquakes or droughts. Others see enemy attacks as the cause, for example by the mysterious sea peoples who shook entire empires in the eastern Mediterranean. Still others point to internal conflicts, uprisings, or economic crises. It was probably a mixture of several factors. Whatever happened, Greece sank into a phase that was later called the Dark Ages. The Dark Centuries, Regression and New Beginning. From about 1100 to 800 BC, we know little about what happened in Greece. Written sources are almost completely absent, and archaeological finds are also sparse. Cities fell into disrepair, art was simpler, trade was severely restricted. Many regions lived again almost as in tribal communities. Society was organized on a smaller scale. Palaces disappeared, and with them the power of great rulers. Instead, smaller communities came to the fore. But out of this apparent darkness, something new also grew. During this time, the Greeks became acquainted with iron, which gradually replaced expensive bronze. Iron made it easier to manufacture weapons and tools, a step that led to new developments in the long term. Homer and the memory of the heroic age. Although the dark centuries were marked by decline, it was also here that the basis for the cultural memory of the Greeks was created. Poets such as Homer, who may have lived in the 8th century BC, collected and handed down stories from the Mycenaean period. The Trojan War, the Odysseys of Odysseus. These epics were not only recited for entertainment, but they formed the identity of the Greeks. They told of a heroic past in which honor, bravery, and divine destinies were closely linked. Trade and connections. But the Mycenaeans were not only warriors, but also trade and seafarers. They traveled far beyond the Aegean, as far as Asia Minor, Cyprus, Egypt, and perhaps even as far as Italy and Spain. Finds of Mycenaean pottery in distant ports prove that they had an extensive trade network. At the same time, they were in close contact with the Minoans. There are many indications that the Mycenaeans took over the Aegean Sea towards the end, after the Minoan culture had been weakened by natural disasters and possibly by Mycenaean conquests. The sudden collapse. Around 1200 BC, something happened that still occupies archaeologists today. The Mycenaean culture collapsed. Palaces were destroyed, cities abandoned, trade collapsed. What had happened? There are many theories. Some suspect natural disasters, earthquakes or droughts. Others see enemy attacks as the cause, for example by the mysterious sea peoples who shook entire empires in the eastern Mediterranean. Still others point to internal conflicts, uprisings, or economic crises. It was probably a mixture of several factors. Whatever happened, Greece sank into a phase that was later called the Dark Ages. The Dark Centuries, Regression and New Beginning. From about 1100 to 800 BC, we know little about what happened in Greece. Written sources are almost completely absent, and archaeological finds are also sparse. Cities fell into disrepair, art was simpler, trade was severely restricted. Many regions lived again almost as in tribal communities. Society was organized on a smaller scale. Palaces disappeared, and with them the power of great rulers. Instead, smaller communities came to the fore. But out of this apparent darkness, something new also grew. During this time, the Greeks became acquainted with iron, which gradually replaced expensive bronze. Iron made it easier to manufacture weapons and tools, a step that led to new developments in the long term. Homer and the memory of the heroic age. Although the dark centuries were marked by decline, it was also here that the Chapter 3. The Birth of the Polis, Athens, Sparta, and Other City-States. As Greece slowly rose from the dark centuries, a new form of coexistence began that was unique in world history, the polis. This did not simply mean a city, but a complex entity that combined political, religious, economic, and social structures. In a polis, people lived not only as subjects of a king or ruler, but as members of a community that largely controlled its own destiny. This development began around the 8th century BC and shaped the Greek world for centuries. A polis usually consisted of an urban center and the surrounding countryside. In the center was the agora, the marketplace where not only trade was conducted, but also political meetings took place. An acropolis often rose above the city, a fortified height on which temples and sanctuaries stood. The polis was small enough for its citizens to know each other personally, but large enough to form an independent community. This close connection between city and country, between citizens and institutions, made the polis something completely new. Each polis developed independently, with its own laws, rituals, and political structures. Nevertheless, they were all united by a common language, religion, and culture. They saw themselves as Hellenes, but differed in their affiliation to their own polis. An Athenian was first and foremost an Athenian, a Spartan first and foremost a Spartan. This identity created belonging, but it also led to rivalries and conflicts that decisively shaped Greek history. This is particularly evident in the example of Athens. Originally ruled by kings, the city transformed over the centuries into one of the most famous democracies of antiquity. Initially, power lay with noble families, who enforced their interests with harsh laws. But social tensions led to reforms. Around 594 BC, the lawgiver Solon created rules that abolished debt bondage and allowed broader layers to have a say in politics. Later, Cleisthenes introduced further reforms that divided the people into phyla, i.e. districts, and broke the power of the old noble families. This laid the foundation for Athenian democracy, in which citizens could raise their voices in the popular assembly. Although women, slaves, and strangers were excluded, this was a revolutionary form of participation compared to other societies of the time. While Athens followed the path of democracy, Sparta developed quite differently. The polis in the Peloponnese was characterized by military rigor and discipline. Surrounded by subjugated populations, the so-called helots, the Spartans created a system that geared their entire society towards war. Even children were prepared for toughness, obedience, and bravery in the ago, a strict educational institution. Men lived in community camps until adulthood, where they trained and fought. Women in Sparta had no political power, but significantly more freedoms than in Athens. They managed property, raised children to be soldiers, and enjoyed respect for their role in the Spartan system. The result was a state that for centuries provided one of the most feared armies of antiquity, but at the same time stood out far less culturally than Athens. In addition to these two well-known examples, there were numerous other polises that went their own way. Corinth developed into a rich trading city which served as a mediator of goods and ideas due to its location between the Aegean and Ionian seas. Thebes in the Boeotian region was always an important power factor and was later even to defeat Sparta in the Battle of Leuctra. Important city-states also emerged on the islands, such as Rhodes, which shone with trade and seafaring, or Chios, known for its poets and traders. The emergence of the polis also had an impact on art, religion, and society. Temples were no longer built only for individual rulers, but for the community. Citizens identified with the gods of their city, Athena for Athens, Artemis for Ephesus, or Apollo for Delphi. Competitions, festivals, and theater performances became part of public life. The polis was not only a political framework, but also a cultural center in which shared experience was in the foreground. The rivalry between the polises was a driving force behind Greek history. Athens and Sparta saw each other as opposites, not only in their political systems, but also in their claim to leadership. While Athens relied on democracy, trade, and cultural flourishing, Sparta stood for discipline, order, and military strength. These antagonisms led to fruitful competition on the one hand and deep enmities that culminated in the Peloponnesian War. Despite all the rivalry, there were moments when the Greeks discovered their commonality. This was particularly evident in the Persian Wars, when the polises joined forces against an overpowering enemy. But the cultural unity of the Greeks was also noticeable in religion, at pan-Hellenic festivals such as the Olympic Games or in the oracles of Delphi. They saw themselves as part of a larger world, even if political fragmentation repeatedly became a problem. The polis was thus not only a form of political organization, but also an attitude to life. It shaped the self-image of the Greeks, it created proximity between citizens and institutions, and it provided the framework for innovations that would have significance far beyond antiquity. The democracy of Athens, the discipline of Sparta, the commercial power of Corinth, these were all expressions of the same idea that a community is more than a ruler or a palace. Thus, a new model of coexistence emerged from the small settlements of the dark centuries, which offered identity and stability for the Greeks. The polis became the centerpiece of ancient Greece, the stage for politics, culture, and war. And it formed the basis for everything we will witness later in this story. The great wars against Persia, the Golden Age of Athens, the rivalries of the city-states, and finally Alexander's expansion. Without the polis, there would be no classical Greece as we know it. In the next chapter, we will look at life within these city-states. What was everyday like within it? What roles did men, women, children, and slaves play? What was the social and economic life that formed the foundation of this unique culture? Chapter 4. Society and Everyday Life in the Polis. When we talk about ancient Greece, we often think of great orators, philosophers, or generals. But most people's lives took place in everyday life, in the rhythm of work, festivals, religion, and community. The polis was not just a political idea, it was a living space in which men, women, children, and slaves fulfilled their roles. This daily togetherness made the polis alive and shaped society more strongly than laws or battles alone ever could. Life in a polis was clearly structured. Citizens were the real bearers of the political order. Being a citizen meant rights and duties at the same time. The right to participate in the People's Assembly, but also the duty to fight in war or to pay taxes and duties. In Athens, you could only become a citizen if both parents were Athenians. In other cities, different rules applied. The status was valuable and was strictly demarcated from strangers, women, and slaves. Men played the central role in almost all polis. They determined politics, they traded, they took part in wars. In Athens, political life was closely linked to everyday life. Those who walked around the agora could not only buy goods, but also take part in discussions, listen to speakers, and vote on laws. In Sparta, on the other hand, the everyday life of men was determined almost exclusively by the military. Even as teenagers, they lived in camps, trained for the war, and only returned to their families as adults. Nevertheless, the bond with the community was stronger than with the individual. In ancient Greece, women had very different roles depending on the polis. In Athens, women's lives were largely confined to the home. They took care of children, supplies, and the household, rarely left the house, and hardly participated in political or public affairs. In Sparta, on the other hand, their position was much freer. They could own land, participate in public life, and enjoy recognition for their task of giving birth to and educating strong warriors. Other Greeks mockingly said that Spartan women had more influence than their husbands because they were constantly at war. The children were prepared for their later roles at an early age. From a certain age, boys received instruction in reading, writing, arithmetic, but also in rhetoric and sports. Education was particularly highly regarded in Athens, as it was considered the basis for participation in politics and culture. Girls usually learned from their mothers at home how to run the household, cook, weave, and manage supplies. In Sparta, it was different. There, girls also received physical training to be healthy and strong, which would later make them good mothers of Spartan warriors. Other Greeks mockingly said that Spartan women had more influence than their husbands because they were constantly at war. The children were prepared for their later roles at an early age. From a certain age, boys received instruction in reading, writing, arithmetic, but also in rhetoric and sports. Education was particularly highly regarded in Athens as it was considered the basis for participation in politics and culture. Girls usually learned from their mothers at home how to run the household, cook, weave, and manage supplies. In Sparta, it was different. There, girls also received physical training to be healthy and strong, which would later make them good mothers of Spartan warriors. In addition to citizens and women, there was a large group in every polis that is often forgotten, the foreigners, the so-called metoken. They had no citizenship but lived permanently in the city. Many of them were craftsmen, merchants, or merchants. In Athens, they formed an important economic basis, without which the polis would not have functioned. They had to pay taxes and do military service, but were not allowed to participate in political decisions. Even lower in the social hierarchy were the slaves. Slavery was a matter of course in ancient Greece and was not considered a moral problem. Slaves worked in households, in fields, in mines, and workshops. Some were prisoners of war, others children of slaves, and still others had not been able to pay debts. Their living conditions were very different. A household slave could be treated almost like a family member, while mining slaves lived in inhumane conditions. Some slaves were able to buy their freedom or were freed by their masters, but the vast majority remained the property of others. Religion permeated everyday life in the polis in all areas. There was hardly an act that was not associated with a prayer, a sacrifice, or a ritual. Families made sacrifices to gods in the home altar. Farmers sacrificed in the fields. Politicians opened meetings with prayers, and entire cities celebrated festivals in honor of their patron gods. In Athens, Athena was the focus. In Sparta, Artemis Orthia was particularly venerated, and in Delphi, the famous oracle of Apollo was consulted. Religious festivals were highlights of the year, during which sacrifices, processions, theatrical performances, and sporting competitions took place. These festivals strengthened the sense of community and made religion a public experience. The economic life of the polis was diverse but mostly modest. Farmers formed the backbone of society. They tilled small fields, grew olives, grain, and wine. Many families lived off what they produced themselves. Craftsmen made pottery, weapons, or fabrics. Merchants brought goods from distant regions. Athens in particular developed a strong seafaring tradition due to its location by the sea, and lived from trade across the Mediterranean. In Sparta, on the other hand, trade was less important, where self-sufficiency was considered the ideal. Leisure and culture played an important role. Sport was not just a physical activity, but a form of education and preparation for war. In grammar schools, young men trained in athletics, wrestling, and javelin throwing. Competitions were part of religious festivals and culminated in the Olympic Games, which took place every 4 years. Poets such as Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Aristophanes performed their plays, which were entertainment, art, and political discussion. Everyday life in the polis was therefore characterized by clear roles, but at the same time by diversity and dynamism. Everyone had their place: the citizen as a politically active member, the woman as the guardian of the house, or in Sparta as a strong figure of public life, the children who were prepared for their tasks, the foreigners as economic support, and the slaves as the basis of the system. This order was not always fair. It was full of inequalities, but it functioned and gave stability to the polis. When we imagine the polis, we see not only walls, temples, and squares, but also the daily life of the people. We hear the voices in the agora, the clatter of the pottery workshops, the shouts of the merchants, the laughter of children playing in narrow streets. We see women fetching water from the well, men arguing about politics, farmers pressing olives, and slaves carrying burdens. All this made the polis a vibrant community that was more than a political invention. It was a living space in which the culture, society, and identity of the Greeks unfolded. In the next chapter, we turn to the faith of the Greeks, which profoundly shaped their world. Myths of Zeus, Athena, Hera, and Poseidon tell not only of gods, but also of values, fears, and hopes of an entire culture. Chapter 5. Religion, Myths, and Gods. The people of ancient Greece lived in a world steeped in gods, heroes, and myths. Religion was not only a part of their lives, but the foundation on which their entire culture rested. In contrast to many later religions, there were no holy scriptures, not a single church, no dogmatic doctrine in ancient Greece. Instead, faith was a living network of stories, rituals, festivals, and sanctuaries that shaped people's thoughts, feelings, and actions. The focus was on a pantheon of gods who seemed so human that you could almost imagine them like neighbors. Zeus, the father of the gods, ruled over Olympus and hurled lightning when he was angry. Hera, his wife, was considered the protector of marriage, but was also known for her jealousy and intrigues. Athena stood for wisdom and the art of war. Poseidon ruled the sea. Demeter took care of the fertility of the fields. Aphrodite for love and beauty. Ares for war. These gods were immortal and powerful, but they were not distant, unattainable beings. They quarreled, loved, betrayed, and reconciled. They were capricious and vulnerable. In short, they were mirrors of human passions in divine form. The myths surrounding these gods told of adventures, battles, and trials. They explained the origin of the world, the order of the cosmos, and the position of man in it. They gave answers to questions that could not otherwise be answered. Why are there seasons? Because Demeter mourns her daughter Persephone, who has to spend part of the year in the realm of Hades. Why is there thunder in the sky? Because Zeus hurls his lightning bolts in anger. Why does life end? Because even heroes like Achilles or Heracles can't escape death completely. In addition to the Olympian gods, numerous local deities, demons, and heroes also played a role. Almost every city had its patron god, its own cults, its own festivals. Athens was inextricably linked with Athena, whose statue towered high above the city on the Acropolis. In Delphi, Apollo was worshipped and advice was sought from his oracle, who spoke through the Pythia, a priestess. In Eleusis, mysteries were celebrated in honor of Demeter and Persephone, mysterious rites whose exact content was so closely guarded that it is not fully known to this day. Religion was not a question of beliefs, but of actions. Sacrifice was at the heart of religious life. Parts of animals, wine, oil, or grain were burned on altars to appease the gods. Large festivals combined victims with processions, theater performances, and sporting competitions. Those who lived in a polis experienced a rhythm of religious festivals every year that structured life and created community. These events were not only an expression of faith, but also social highlights at which the entire polis gathered. The myths were not only religious stories, but also a form of literature, philosophy, and identity. In his Theogony, poets such as Hesiod told of the emergence of the world out of chaos, of the battles between titans and gods, of the reign of Zeus. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, Homer sang not only of heroes such as Achilles and Odysseus, but also of the intervention of the gods in the fate of mankind. These stories were sung, told, and brought to the stage in dramas. They were moral lessons, warnings, and role models at the same time. The hero myths in particular had an important function. Figures such as Heracles, Perseus, or Theseus stood between gods and men. They experienced trials, passed adventures, killed monsters, but they also suffered, failed, and died. They reflected the ideal of the human being, who could achieve great things despite weaknesses. The heroes were projection surfaces for courage, honor, and glory, but also for guilt, tragedy, and hubris, the self-arrogance that evoked the wrath of the gods. A central idea in the Greek faith was fate, the Moira. Even the gods could not completely escape him. Every person had his or her assigned share of life, and anyone who tried to exceed it risked punishment. Hubris was therefore one of the greatest dangers. It meant forgetting one's own limitations, behaving like a god, and inevitably it drew nemesis, retribution. This idea shaped not only religion, but also the tragedies of poets in which heroes failed because of their pride and arrogance. The Greeks also believed in life after death, but their ideas of it were rather bleak. Most souls ended up in the realm of Hades, a realm of shadows where the dead eked out a pale existence. Only a few who had earned special merit were allowed to enter the Elysian realms, a kind of paradise. Others, on the other hand, who had incurred great guilt, suffered eternal punishments in Tartarus. These images reflected the fear of death, but also the hope for a better existence. In ancient Greece, religion was not only a private matter, but deeply political. Each polis worshipped its patron gods, and its cult was closely linked to the identity of the community. In Athens, for example, the Panathenaic festival in honor of Athena was a highlight of the year, during which the city honored its sanctuary in a procession. Such festivals were an expression of the pride and unity of the polis. At the same time, religious sanctuaries also became places of international encounter. Olympia, Delphi, or Nemea were not only religious sites, but also centers where Greeks from different regions came together to hold competitions or consult oracles. When we look at the religion of the Greeks today, we see more than just ancient myths. We recognize a world in which people try to interpret and shape the forces of life. Their gods were human and divine at the same time. Their myths reflected fears and hopes. Their rituals created community. And although no one in Athens or Sparta had a holy scripture, the faith lived everywhere, in festivals, in sacrifices, in plays, in the stories that were passed down from generation to generation. This makes it understandable why religion and myth in Greece were not just a matter of temples or priests, but the heart of culture itself. They determined how people saw the world, how they acted, and how they understood their own role in the cosmos. Without this foundation, neither art nor philosophy, neither politics nor the wars of the Greeks would be conceivable. In the next chapter, we will turn to the art and architecture that was closely linked to this religious world and in which the Greeks expressed their ideas of beauty, harmony, and divine order. Chapter 6. Art and Architecture, from Temples to the Classical Period. The Greeks understood, like hardly any other people, how to make their ideas of order, harmony, and beauty visible in art and architecture. Her works were an expression of a culture that sought to worship the divine, celebrate the human, and find the measure in all things. When we think of ancient Greece today, columned halls, marble statues, and ornate vases appear in our mind's eye. Images that still shape the Western idea of aesthetics today. Early on, the Greeks began to build temples that were more than religious sites. They were symbols of community, places where people honored their gods and, at the same time, flaunted their own identity. Architecture developed clear forms that were repeated and refined over centuries. In particular, the three classical orders of columns, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, are symbols of Greek architecture. The Doric style, austere and massive, conveyed strength and constancy. The Ionian style, with its elegant volutes, seemed lighter and more refined. The Corinthian style, richly decorated with acanthus leaves, exuded an almost luxurious splendor. These styles were not only technical solutions, but an expression of an attitude that found the ideal of beauty in the relationship between symmetry and proportion. A highlight of this architecture is the Acropolis of Athens, especially the Parthenon, the Temple of Athena. Built in the 5th century BC under Pericles, it is still considered a masterpiece of classical architecture. Its proportions are calculated so precisely that even small optical corrections have been incorporated. Columns are slightly inclined inwards to appear more stable. The base is minimally curved to compensate for distortions. For the Greeks, this was not just architecture, but a manifestation of harmony that reflected the relationship between man, God, and nature. In addition to the temples, the Greeks also developed other forms of architecture that shaped life in the polis. Theaters were open buildings in the open air that could accommodate thousands of people. Its semicircular shape with rising rows of seats ensured perfect acoustics so that even in the last row, the words of an actor were intelligible. Tragedies and comedies were performed here, which not only offered entertainment, but also dealt with religious and political topics. Sports facilities such as stadiums and grammar schools were also an expression of a culture that shaped body and mind in equal measure. Sculpture underwent a development in ancient Greece that strove towards perfection in several stages. The early kouroi, standing youth figures from the 6th century BC, still appeared rigid and frontal, with a hint of a smile. They were reminiscent of Egyptian models, but were already an expression of an independent Greek design language. Later, in the classical period, sculpture achieved a new naturalness. Statues such as the discus thrower of Myron or the spearman of Polykleitos show the human body in motion, in ideal harmony of strength and grace. Polykleitos even developed a theory, the so-called canon, in which he mathematically determined the proportions of the body. For the Greeks, beauty was not a subjective sensation, but an objectively measurable relationship that was reflected in nature and in man. Finally, in Hellenism, the statues became more dramatic, more emotional, full of movement. Works such as the Laocoon group or the Nike of Samothrace show not only perfect bodies, but also pain, ecstasy, and dynamism. Art moved away from the ideal of calm and harmony and approached the expression of the living in all its facets. Painting was no less important, even if only a few original works have survived to us today. Frescoes and murals decorated houses and public buildings. Particularly well known are the vase paintings, which open a window into the world of the Greeks today. They show scenes from everyday life, mythology, sports, and war. Initially, geometric patterns dominated, but later figurative representations in black and red figure technique were created with an astonishing wealth of detail. The art of the Greeks was closely linked to religion and myth, but it was more than just a cult. It was a medium to reflect on the image of man. The body was not considered sinful or imperfect, but beautiful and godlike. Depicting naked was not a sign of shamelessness, but of pride. Man became the measure of all things, and in this attitude lay a decisive step in the development of Western culture. This image of man was also reflected in the architecture. Temples were dedicated to the gods, but they were always sized in such a way that they were in proportion to humans. Unlike the gigantic buildings in Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Greeks did not want to make their visitors appear small and reverent, but to see them as part of a harmonious order. The connection between art and politics was unmistakable. Rulers and cities used magnificent temples and statues to show their power and importance. Pericles had the Acropolis expanded to demonstrate the greatness of Athens. Hellenistic kings donated monumental works to legitimize their rule. Art was never just decoration, but always also an expression of identity and aspiration. But for all its political function, Greek art was carried by an idea that went far beyond this: the pursuit of the beautiful, the good, and the true. This ideal, visible in temples, statues, vases, and theaters, made the art of Greece timeless. It was not only important for the Greeks themselves, but also shaped Rome, the Renaissance, classicism, and our current idea of culture. Today, when we look at a white marble sculpture in the museum or walk through replicas of Greek temple architecture, we experience only a part of what these works once were. Originally, many statues were brightly painted. Temples were richly decorated, theaters full of life. They were not dead monuments, but living expressions of a culture that placed people and their world at the center. Thus, the art and architecture of ancient Greece shows more than just craftsmanship. It reveals an attitude that elevated beauty, harmony, and moderation to the highest principle, without forgetting the vitality of life. In this connection lies their magic, which continued to work for thousands of years and still determines our idea of what is beautiful, noble, and classic. In the next chapter, we will turn to the beginnings of sport and the Olympic Games, which were not only competition and glory, but also an expression of religious and social life. Chapter 7: The First Olympic Games and Sports Culture. When you think of sports today, of competitions in the stadium, of the cheers of the spectators, and of the striving for glory and victory, you still unconsciously feel the spirit of ancient Greece. Because it was there that the idea of sporting competition as a cultural event was born, which went far beyond mere body fighting. The Olympic Games, which were first attested in 776 BC, became a symbol of unity and religion, of glory and honor, of the relationship between man and God. They were more than just sports, they were a celebration of life itself. The Games were held every 4 years in Olympia, a sacred site in the Peloponnese dedicated to the god Zeus. Olympia was not a city-state, but a sanctuary in which stood a huge temple of Zeus and the famous statue of the god created by Phidias, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Here, people from all regions of Greece gathered to see the best athletes competing. During the Games, a holy truce, the so-called Olympic truce, was in place so that the participants could travel safely. Even when polis were at war, they had to let their enmities rest for the duration of the Games. The competitions were strictly regulated from the beginning and accompanied by religious rituals. Athletes swore before the gods could compete honestly and fairly. Sacrifices were offered, processions were held, and victory was not only for man, but also for the deity he honored. Sport and religion were inextricably linked, so that the Games were more like a grand ceremony than a secular competition. The program of the early Olympic Games began modestly with the stadium run, a sprint over about 192 meters. But soon other disciplines were added: the dialos, a double run; the dolikos, a long-distance run; wrestling matches, discus throw, javelin throw, and the long jump. Particularly respected was the pancration, a mixture of boxing and rings which managed almost without rules and was one of the toughest competitions. Equally spectacular were chariot races, which took place in a large arena, the hippodrome. It was not the charioteer, but the owner of the horses who received the fame, so that even rich aristocrats could claim sporting successes in this way. Athletes competed naked, which not only served freedom of movement, but was also intended to show the beauty and power of the body. In ancient Greece, the body was a symbol of the divine measure, and sport was a form of worship. The sweat of the athletes was even considered sacred, and statues of winners commemorated those who had prevailed in competition. Prizes were not sums of gold or money, but usually a simple olive wreath, which, however, meant infinite fame. Whoever won in Olympia was forever a hero who was received like a king in his hometown, often received lifelong privileges, and went down in history. However, sport was not only a spectacle for the elite, but part of everyday life in the polis. In the grammar schools and palaces, young men trained regularly. The gymnasion was not only a place of physical exercise, but also a social meeting place and an educational institution. This is where philosophy was discussed, where young people learned to read, write, and rhetoric, and where physical and mental training were combined. For the Greeks, the idea that a healthy mind lived in a healthy body was self-evident. The Games in Olympia were not the only ones of their kind. In Delphi, the Pythian Games were celebrated in honor of Apollo. In Nemea, the Nemean Games, and in Isthmia, the Isthmian Games in honor of Poseidon. Together, these competitions formed the so-called Pan-Hellenic Games, which connected the entire Greek region. They were an expression of a common identity, even if the polis were often politically hostile. The competitive spirit that the Greeks developed shaped not only the sport, but their entire culture. Agon, competition, was a basic principle of life. Poets vied for the best verses, orators for the most convincing arguments, cities for the greatest power. Sporting competition was only one form of this comprehensive pursuit of fame and honor. He showed that performance, courage, and perseverance were values that the community recognized and celebrated. But the sport also had its downsides. It was not uncommon for fraud to occur, for example through bribery of referees or manipulation. In Olympia, statues were even erected condemning those who had won dishonestly, as a reminder to all future athletes. The toughness of many disciplines also repeatedly led to injuries or even death. But for the Greeks, this was part of the game. The glory that was at stake outweighed the danger. The Games also offered a stage for encounters and exchange. Merchants used the gatherings to sell goods, philosophers gave speeches, artists exhibited their works. The Olympics were thus not only a sporting event, but a cultural center in which politics, religion, art, and business came together. The Games acted as a link in a fragmented world that was otherwise often at war. The fact that the Greeks valued the body and competition so highly was an expression of their view of humanity. For them, man was not a weak being who lived in the shadow of the gods, but a being who could show his dignity and his closeness to the divine in competition. Sport was a ritual of self-assurance, a celebration of life that brought strength, discipline, and beauty into harmony. The Olympic Games lasted for centuries until they were banned by Christian emperors in the 4th century AD because they were associated with pagan cults. But their legacy was so strong that it was revived many centuries later in the modern era. The idea of bringing people together in peaceful competition is one of the great cultural achievements of ancient Greece, the radiance of which continues to this day. When we talk about the Olympics today, about records, about the Olympic idea, we still hear the echo of those old days. It is the echo of a world in which sport meant not only strength and skill, but honor, religion, and community. In the naked bodies of the athletes, in the cheers of the spectators, in the splendor of the olive wreaths, an ideal was reflected that celebrated man in all his dignity. In the next chapter, we look at the two great rivals, Athens and Sparta, which could hardly be more different and whose competition decisively shaped the history of Greece. Chapter 8. Athens and Sparta, Rivals for Supremacy. When telling the story of ancient Greece, one inevitably comes across the contrast between Athens and Sparta. These two polis embodied two completely different models of life, two political systems, two social orders that determined not only their own development, but also the fate of the whole of Greece. Their competition was not only a struggle for power, but also a conflict between ideas that still fascinate today. Athens was a city that grew through trade, seafaring, and culture. Its location on the coast of Attica made it a natural center of exchange, and its population was diverse. From these prerequisites, a system developed that enabled citizens to have a say and participate. The democracy that emerged here was an experiment that changed the world. Men who were recognized as citizens gathered on the Phoenix, a hill near the Agora, and decided together on laws, war, and peace. The art of oratory became a weapon, persuasiveness a form of power. This participation gave the Athenians a strong self-confidence and the feeling of steering the fate of the city together. Sparta, on the other hand, was located in the interior of the Peloponnese, shielded by mountains, without large ports and largely independent of trade. This geographical location favored a society that relied entirely on the military. The Spartans lived in an order based on discipline, obedience, and simplicity. Their entire lives were dedicated to producing warriors who could defend the polis and secure its supremacy. The state controlled people's education, everyday life, and even their private lives. The individual counted for little, the community everything. The contrast between the two cities was evident in every facet of life. Culture flourished in Athens. Philosophers, poets, artists, and architects created works that the world knows to this day. The theater was a central institution. Philosophy developed questions that are still asked. Sculpture and architecture reached their classical perfection. Wealth from trade and silver mines flowed into construction projects such as the Acropolis. In Sparta, on the other hand, the culture remained simple. Art and philosophy were not the focus, but training, the art of war, and the constant readiness to fight. Education meant first and foremost toughness, perseverance, and obedience. The position of women also differed significantly. In Athens, they were largely confined to the house, but in Sparta, they had remarkable freedoms. They could own land, play sports, and take an active part in public life, while their husbands were in camps or at war. For many Greeks, this image was unusual, even strange, and it contributed to the uniqueness of Sparta. The rivalry between the two cities grew with their power. During the Persian Wars, they still stood side by side. At Marathon and Salamis, Athenians and Spartans fought together against the superiority of the Persian Empire. But tensions were already evident in this alliance. Sparta took the lead on land, Athens dominated at sea. After the victories over Persia, Athens founded the Delish-Attic League, an alliance of many poli, which officially served the defense but in reality led to Athenian hegemony. With the contributions of the members, Athens built a powerful fleet and used the funds to make its city magnificent. Sparta watched this development with suspicion. While Athens rose to become a maritime power and exported its democratic system, Sparta adhered to its strict order and saw itself as the guardian of Greece's traditional values. The differences intensified as more and more poli had to choose between the two powers. They were either on the side of Athens or on the side of Sparta. The Greek region split into two camps, and the conflict became inevitable. The Peloponnesian War, which eventually broke out, was the direct result of this rivalry. For almost 3 decades, Athens and Sparta fought for supremacy. It was a war that was not only fought on battlefields, but also shook cities, the economy, and culture. Athens, with its fleet and wealth, relied on offensives and sieges, while Sparta relied on its disciplined hoplite army. In the end, Sparta was to win, but the price was high. All of Greece was exhausted, many poli were destroyed, and the old balance of power began to falter. But even if Sparta won the war, Athens remained the cultural model. His philosophy, his democracy, his art and architecture shaped not only the Greeks, but later also the Romans and the entire Western tradition. Sparta, on the other hand, left behind the image of a society that impressed with its austerity and warrior culture, but also broke down because of its rigidity. The contrast between Athens and Sparta is thus more than an episode of history. It is a symbol of two ways in which societies can organize themselves: open democracy, which is geared towards participation and innovation, and the closed military order, which focuses on discipline and stability. Both models had their strengths, both had their weaknesses. Together, they turned ancient Greece into a field of experimentation, the questions and answers of which still occupy us today. If you look at these two cities, you can see that the Greek world drew its strength precisely from its diversity. Athens and Sparta faced each other like two reflections of human possibilities. One creative, open, democratic; the other strict, closed, military. Their competition was tragic, destructive, but it also made visible how differently societies can function and how much conflicts arise from such opposites. In the next chapter, we turn to the Persian Wars, in which Greece, despite its internal rivalries, found unity and asserted its place in world history in legendary battles.
Chapter 9. The Persian Wars, Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis. The Persian Wars are among the decisive moments in Greek history. In them, the fate of the entire Hellenic world was at stake, because they meant the struggle between the free city-states of Greece and the huge empire of the Persians. It was a clash of cultures, of different political orders, and of armies that could hardly have been more unequal. The fact that the Greeks won in the end not only created a new self-confidence, but also opened the way for the Golden Age of Athens. The roots of the conflict lay in Asia Minor, where the Persians had extended their rule to the coasts of the Aegean Sea. Many Greeks living there, especially in the cities of Ionia, thus came under Persian control. When the Ionian Revolt broke out in 499 BC, supported by Athens and Eretria, the Persian king Darius reacted harshly. The revolt was crushed, but the Persians now had a reason to turn against the rebellious Greeks. Darius wanted to punish the recalcitrant cities and at the same time extend his influence to Europe. The first major confrontation came in 490 BC, when a Persian army under Darius's command landed in Attica. On the plain of Marathon, the Persian troops met the Athenians, who fought without the help of Sparta because they were still bound by a religious festival. Despite their numerical inferiority, the Athenians won a battle that became legendary. Their success was the result of disciplined hoplite formations and the determination to defend their homeland. The legend tells of a messenger who, after winning the marathon, ran to Athens to deliver the news and collapsed there dead, the origin of modern marathon running. The victory at Marathon gave the Greeks a sense of strength and showed that the all-powerful Persians were not invincible. But Darius' successor Xerxes did not give up. In 480 BC, he led a huge army into Greece, accompanied by a fleet to secure supplies. The figures handed down by ancient historians are probably exaggerated, but undeniably, this was an army of enormous size that the fragmented polis of Greece could hardly resist. In this situation, a rare unity occurred. Several Greek cities, including Athens and Sparta, joined forces to repel the common enemy. One of the most famous episodes of this period is the Battle of Thermopylae. At a narrow pass, 300 Spartans under King Leonidas, supported by several thousand allies, opposed the overwhelming army. For 3 days they held the pass, inflicted heavy losses on the Persians, and showed that courage and discipline could hold their own even against superior numbers. In the end, however, a local man betrayed a detour to the Persians, and Leonidas and his men were trapped. They fought to the death, were defeated, but their sacrifice became a symbol of Greek bravery and devotion. Thermopylae was a defeat militarily, but morally a triumph that inspired the Greeks to continue resisting. Meanwhile, Athens was threatened. The city was evacuated, its population fled to the islands, while Xerxes' troops conquered and burned Athens. But the Athenians did not give up. They pinned their hopes on their fleet, which had been organized by Themistocles, one of the most capable politicians and strategists. Themistocles had already promoted the expansion of the Athenian fleet years earlier, which now proved decisive. In the Bay of Salamis, the decisive naval battle took place. The Persian fleet, numerically superior, could not play to its strength in the narrow waters. The Greeks took advantage of the narrowness. Their agile ships rammed and sank numerous Persian triremes. Xerxes had to watch the defeat, and although his land army was still strong, control of the sea was lost. Without safe supply routes, the Persian advance became untenable. Xerxes withdrew a large part of his army, but left a part under Mardonius in Greece. The following year, the last decisive landing battle took place at Plataea in 479 BC, in which the Greeks defeated the remaining Persian troops. At the same time, the Greek fleet achieved another success at Mycale in Asia Minor. With this, the Persian threat was averted for the time being, and the Greeks could feel victorious who had beaten back a world power. The consequences of these wars were immense. For the Greeks, the victory was proof of their superiority, not only militarily, but also culturally and politically. They had shown that free citizens who fought for their city could be stronger than the soldiers of a huge empire. Athens in particular benefited greatly from the victory. It rose to become the leading maritime power, organized the Delish-Attic Sea League, and used its funds to develop its city into a center of power and culture. The Acropolis, the Parthenon, the height of democracy, all this was only possible because the Persian Wars had been won. For Sparta, the glory of Thermopylae was a lasting legacy. Even if it did not ultimately develop the same cultural appeal as Athens, it remained the epitome of military discipline and bravery. Together, the two cities had shown that Greece, despite internal divisions, was capable of holding its own against an overpowering enemy. However, the Persian Wars were more than a military conflict. They were a clash of two worlds. On the one hand, the huge centralized empire of the Persians, on the other, the fragmented but free polis of Greece. Its outcome created a narrative that the Greeks saw themselves as defenders of freedom against Oriental despotism, an image that still reverberated centuries later in Europe's ideas of East and West. With the victories at Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis, Greece had not only been saved, but also raised to a new level. People saw themselves as part of a larger community, capable of defeating even the most powerful opponents. This experience laid the foundation for the self-confidence of the classical era, in which Athens in particular rose to its cultural and political heyday. In the next chapter, we will dedicate ourselves to this golden age of Athens, in which democracy, philosophy, art, and science flourished in a way that the world had never seen before.
Chapter 10: The Golden Age of Athens, Pericles, and Democracy. After the Persian Wars, Athens entered an era that is still referred to today as the Golden Age. The city, which had prevailed against the overpowering enemy through courage and naval might, gained not only influence but also self-confidence. Under the leadership of the statesman Pericles, who shaped political life for decades, Athens developed into a center of democracy, art, philosophy, and science. It was a time when the foundations were laid that still influence our ideas of politics, culture, and society today. Athens' democracy had its roots before the Persian Wars, but now it was taking full effect. The People's Assembly, the ecclesia, was the heart of the political order. Here, every citizen with full rights, i.e., free men of Athenian descent, could take the floor and vote on laws, war, and peace. About 4 times a month, thousands gathered on the Pnyx, a hill west of the Acropolis, and decided the fate of the city with their hands raised. This direct form of democracy was unique. It was not representatives or parties that determined, but the citizens themselves. However, political participation was tied to obligations. Those who were citizens had to serve in the army or navy, had to pay taxes, and offer sacrifices to the gods. Women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded, so that only a fraction of the population actually participated in democracy. But for those who belonged to it, it was an unprecedented level of co-determination and freedom. Pericles, who played a leading role from about 461 to 429 BC, was a master at directing this democracy. He was not a tyrant, but a strategist who won over the citizens to his politics through oratory, intelligence, and foresight. His speeches, handed down by Thucydides, show a man who understood Athens not only as a city, but as an ideal. Under his leadership, democracy flourished, the lottery system for offices was spread, and poorer citizens were also given the opportunity to participate in politics, as they were paid compensation for their participation. At the same time, Athens developed into a cultural metropolis. With the funds of the Deliciatic Maritime League, which Athens had founded after the Persian Wars, the city financed not only its fleet, but also magnificent buildings. The Parthenon, probably the most famous building of Greek antiquity, was built during this time. Built of white marble and decorated with sculptures of Phidias, it was dedicated to Athena, the patron goddess of the city. The entire Acropolis became a symbol of Athenian self-confidence, a sign of greatness and cultural flourishing. But not only architecture, but also the arts experienced a unique blossoming. The theater was an integral part of public life. Tragedies by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, as well as comedies by Aristophanes, were performed in front of thousands of spectators. These pieces were not mere entertainment, but reflections on politics, religion, morality, and human fate. They reflected Athenian society, its hopes and fears, its successes and crises. During this time, philosophy began to steer thinking in new directions. With his questions, Socrates questioned the foundations of knowledge and challenged his fellow citizens to reflect on justice, virtue, and truth. Plato, his student, and Aristotle, again a student of Plato, developed systems that shaped European philosophy for centuries. The gymnasium and the academy became places where thinking and education became central values. Athens also made progress in science and technology. Hippocrates founded medicine as an independent discipline that broke away from mythical ideas. Mathematicians such as Hippocrates of Chios laid the foundations for geometry. Astronomers such as Meton dealt with calendar questions. This development was part of a larger trend, the attempt to explain the world not only through myths, but through observation and reason. However, Athens' prosperity was not only based on its own achievements. The Delian-Attic League was originally a defensive alliance against Persia, but Athens turned it into an instrument of power. The member cities had to make contributions, which in practice often had the effect of tribute payments. Those who refused were called to order by military force. Athens expanded its fleet, secured trade routes, and thus became the leading power in the Aegean Sea. This domination brought wealth, but also created tensions with other polis, especially Sparta. So the Golden Age was a time of splendor and shadow at the same time. While Athens set new standards in the cultural and political field, social inequality grew internally and rivalry with other powers abroad. Nevertheless, pride and democracy remained unbroken. In his famous eulogy for the fallen of the Peloponnesian War, Pericles praised Athens as a model for all, as a city in which freedom, beauty, and wisdom are united. This self-image was formative. Athens saw itself not only as one polis among many, but as a beacon of the Hellenic world. And indeed, its culture had an impact far beyond the borders. Artists, thinkers, and politicians from other cities looked to Athens. Romans later adopted his ideas, and the Renaissance took them up again. But the splendor was not eternal. Even during the height, the conflict with Sparta became apparent, which finally escalated into the Peloponnesian War and ended the Golden Age. Pericles himself died during a plague that struck Athens, and with him the city lost its most important leader. Nevertheless, the epic under his leadership remains a high point in world history, a moment in which a society seemed to exhaust all its possibilities for a short time. When we look back on those years today, we recognize the roots of many of our ideas. The idea that citizens decide together, that art is a public good, that philosophy and science help people move forward, all this was tested and exemplified in Athens. The Golden Age was thus not only a high point in Greek history, but also a foundation of Western culture. In the next chapter, we turn to the philosophers and scientists themselves, whose thoughts and discoveries changed the world in ways that continue to our present day.
Chapter 11. Philosophy and Science. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. The intellectual flowering of ancient Greece found its strongest expression in philosophy. While myths and religion explained the world in other cultures, the Greeks sought rational answers. They asked questions that were no longer determined by gods or traditions alone, but by observation, logic, and argumentation. The step from mythological thinking to philosophical research was one of the greatest upheavals in the history of the human mind. Even before Socrates, there were thinkers who were called the pre-Socrates. Thales of Miletus, for example, asked about the primordial material of the world and came to the conclusion that everything emerged from water. Anaximander thought in more abstract categories and spoke of the apeiron, the infinite, as the origin of all things. Heraclitus declared that everything was in flux, while Parmenides claimed the opposite. Being was unchanging and eternal. These early philosophers were not looking for stories, but for principles that ordered the world. In doing so, they laid the foundation for a way of thinking that continued to have an effect for centuries. Socrates was the one who placed philosophy at the center of public life. He left no writings, but shaped his fellow citizens through conversations. With his questions, he made people think about their own convictions. What is justice? What is virtue? What is knowledge? Socrates did not ask such questions to give quick answers, but to sharpen thinking. His method, meutics, was like a midwife's art. He helped people to bring out insights from themselves. Many found him a nuisance because he questioned certainties. In the end, he was sentenced to death in Athens, officially for godlessness and seduction of youth, but in fact because he held up a mirror to the citizens. His death in 399 BC became a symbol of freedom of thought. Plato, his pupil, made a philosophical system out of his master's thoughts. He founded the Academy, the first major philosophical school in the world, where students and teachers discussed for generations. Plato not only saw the world through the eyes of the senses, but believed in a higher reality, the world of ideas. Everything we see is for him only images of these perfect forms. A circle that one draws is never perfect, but the idea of the circle is perfect and exists independently of the material world. The same applies to concepts such as justice, beauty, or truth. For Plato, philosophy was the way to approach this ideal world. In his work Politeia, he sketched the picture of an ideal state in which philosophers should take over, because they alone possess the true knowledge. His ideas influenced political philosophy into modern times and beyond. Aristotle, again a student of Plato, took a different path. While his teacher focused on the world of ideas, Aristotle turned to empirical observation. For him, the truth was not beyond the world, but in the world itself. He studied plants, animals, the human body. He classified forms of government, developed systems of logic, and analyzed poetry and rhetoric. Aristotle was a polymath who worked on almost all fields of knowledge of his time. His doctrine of the golden mediocrity saw the ideal of human action in the middle between extremes. For him, courage lay between cowardice and foolhardiness, generosity between stinginess and waste. This practical ethics made his thinking compatible with many areas of life. His school, the Lyceum, became a center of scientific research that continued to have an impact for centuries. In addition to the great names of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, a large number of other philosophical currents flourished. The Sophists were teachers who taught rhetoric and the art of persuasion. They emphasized that truth is relative and that it is important to win in the argument. Many Athenians valued their abilities, but Socrates and Plato saw them as a danger to the search for truth. Later, schools developed such as the Stoicism, which gave rise to Stoicism, or Epicureanism, which played a major role in the Hellenistic period. The sciences also developed in this epoch. Mathematicians such as Pythagoras associated numbers with cosmic order and coined the idea that harmony can be found in mathematical ratios. Hippocrates founded medicine as a rational subject, in which diseases had natural causes and were not understood as punishments from the gods. Astronomers such as Aristarchus of Samos suspected that the Earth moved around the sun, a finding that was confirmed thousands of years later. Euclid wrote his Elements in Alexandria, a work of geometry that had the character of a schoolbook until modern times. Archimedes invented mathematical methods and technical devices that prove his genius to this day. What was special about Greek philosophy and science was the attitude with which people looked at the world. It was not a matter of blindly adopting traditions, but of critically examining them. People wanted to understand how things really worked, whether in nature, in the state, or in human life. This search for reasons and causes, this willingness to go beyond the obvious, was the origin of what we now call science. The combination of philosophy and everyday life made its impact even stronger. Questions about justice, happiness, or virtue were not abstract exercises, but were supposed to make life better. Philosophy was an art of living, a way to shape one's own existence. Socrates, addressing his fellow citizens on the streets of Athens, perhaps embodied this spirit most clearly. Philosophy was not enclosed in books, but part of public life. The impact of these thinkers was immense. Even the Romans adopted much of Greek thought. Christian theology drew on Plato and Aristotle. The Renaissance rediscovered their works, and the Enlightenment built on its critique of reason. To this day, their questions shape our debates, and concepts such as democracy, ethics, or logic are hardly conceivable without them. Thus, the epic of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle shows that ancient Greece not only produced temples and warriors, but above all a spiritual revolution that forms the foundation of our civilization. Her courage to ask questions and seek answers makes her immortal. In the next chapter, we turn to theater and literature, where the Greeks not only entertained themselves, but also reflected on life, gods, and politics, and recreated their world on stage.
Chapter 12. Theater and Literature. From Homer to Euripides. Greek culture was not only a world of philosophers and statesmen, but also a culture of poets, singers, and actors. From Homer's early epics to the great tragedies and comedies of the 5th century BC, the Greeks created a literature that is still read, performed, and admired today. It was not only art, but also a mirror and critique of society, a medium in which questions of gods, people, guilt, and freedom were negotiated. At the beginning there are the epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are attributed to Homer. Even if we don't know for sure whether there was a historical person Homer, or whether the poems were the work of several generations, he is considered the first poet in Europe. The Iliad tells of the Trojan War, of Achilles, Hector, and Agamemnon, of the wrath of the hero and of the cruelty of war. The Odyssey describes the wanderings of Odysseus, who wanders the seas for 10 years after the fall of Troy, defeats monsters, resists the temptation of the sirens, and finally returns to Ithaca. These stories were more than entertainment. They created a collective memory, a common world of ideas in which the Greeks recognized their values: courage, cunning, honor, but also suffering, guilt, and transience. In addition to Homer, Hesiod shaped early literature with his works Theogony and Works and Days. While the Theogony told of the origins of the gods and the world, Works and Days offered practical advice for peasant life, combined with moral admonitions. Here it becomes clear that literature not only sang about great heroes, but also addressed the everyday life and work of ordinary people. In the 6th century BC, forms of poetry emerged in many regions of Greece that were more personal. Poets like Sappho of Lesbos wrote about love and passion, Alcaios about politics and struggle, Tyrtaios about war. This poetry was often intended for reading at symposia, drinking bouts in which men sang, discussed, and played music. It gave a voice to the feelings and thoughts of the individual, which stood next to the great tales of war and gods. The highlight of Greek literature, however, was the theater. It developed from religious festivals in honor of Dionysus, where choirs sang and performed dances. From these rituals, drama gradually emerged, in which actors spoke dialogues and embodied characters. The theater was not a minor matter, but a central event of the polis. New plays were performed in Athens during the Dionysia, and the whole city took part. Thousands flocked to the theater at the foot of the Acropolis to watch tragedies and comedies. Tragedy was the noblest form of this drama. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides are the three great names. Aeschylus, the eldest of them, brought the gods and fate to the stage. In his plays, such as the Oresteia, the question of guilt, retribution, and justice is negotiated. Sophocles led the drama to formal completion. His King Oedipus is still a symbol of the tragic hero who, despite all his efforts, cannot escape fate. Finally, Euripides showed people in all their contradictions. His Medea, who kills her children in revenge, is an example of how he combined the tragic with psychological depth. Comedy was juxtaposed with tragedy. Aristophanes was the great master of this form. In his plays, he mocked politicians, poets, philosophers, and society itself. In The Frogs, for example, he has poets compete against each other in Hades, and in The Clouds, he caricatures Socrates as an aloof thinker. The comedy was not only entertainment, but also political satire, a mirror in which the polis had to recognize itself. The special thing about Greek theater was its combination of art, religion, and politics. Plays were performed as part of religious festivals, but they dealt with topics that were highly topical: war and peace, power and powerlessness, guilt and innocence. The audience was not passive, but actively participated, discussed, judged, and learned. Theater was education and community, a school of life that was open to the whole polis. The Greeks also achieved significant things in prose. Herodotus wrote his histories, the first comprehensive account of history that attempted to explain causes and not just report events.
Thucydides went one step further. His work on the Peloponnesian War is considered a masterpiece of critical historiography, sober, analytical, and without mythical embellishments. Xenophon told of campaigns and political events. Plato wrote his philosophical dialogues in a literary form that still fascinates today. Greek literature was therefore multifaceted. It ranged from epics and myths to poetry and drama to historiography and philosophy. But it had a common goal: to understand people in their world. Whether Homer sang of the hero Achilles, Sophocles depicted the fate of Oedipus, Aristophanes mocked the politicians of his time, or Thucydides analyzed the causes of war, the question was always what makes a human being, what decisions he makes, what consequences they have. The influence of this literature was enormous. The Romans adopted it, the Renaissance rediscovered it, and the Enlightenment saw it as a model for reason and criticism. To this day, the tragedies are performed, the epics read, the historical works studied. The voices of the ancient Greeks have not fallen silent, because they asked questions that are timeless, about guilt and responsibility, about love and hate, about power and justice. If we look at the theater and literature of ancient Greece, we see a culture that knew how to mirror itself. She celebrated heroes and mocked fools. She depicted gods and examined people. She combined ritual with art and politics, with poetry. Its magic lies in this diversity, and that is why it remains a cornerstone of European culture. In the next chapter, we turn to the Peloponnesian War, in which the rivalry between Athens and Sparta erupted openly, plunging the Greek world into a protracted, destructive conflict.
Chapter 13. The Peloponnesian War. Athens' Decline. The Peloponnesian War was one of the longest and most destructive conflicts in Greek history. For almost 3 decades, from 431 to 404 BC, Athens and Sparta stood against each other with their respective allies. What began as a power struggle between 2 rival city-states developed into a war that shook all of Greece and ushered in the end of Athenian domination. It was not only a military conflict, but also a clash of different systems and ways of life that left deep scars on the Greek world. Long before the outbreak of the war, the causes lay in the rivalry between the 2 powers. After the Persian Wars, Athens had risen to become the leading maritime power, had founded the Delish-Attic Sea League, and gradually transformed it into an instrument of its hegemony. The tribute payments of the allies flowed to Athens, where they were used not only for naval construction, but also for magnificent buildings. Sparta, on the other hand, saw itself as the guardian of the traditional order, as the leading power on land, and as the antithesis to Athens' expansion. Mistrust between the 2 sides grew. Minor conflicts escalated the situation until open war finally broke out. The war took place in several phases. In the first phase, the so-called Archidamic War, named after the Spartan king Archidamos, Spartan troops regularly invaded Attica and devastated the country. Athens was able to attack the Spartan coastal cities and the Peloponnese with its fleet, but it avoided major land battles. The Athenians retreated behind their long walls, which connected the city with the port of Piraeus, and trusted in their naval supremacy. This strategy seemed successful at first, but an unexpected disaster struck Athens, a devastating plague that broke out through the confinement of the besieged city. Thousands of people died, including Pericles, the most important statesman in Athens. His death was a heavy blow, because with him, the city lost its most prudent leadership. Despite the losses, Athens held out in the war. In 421 BC, a peace agreement was even concluded, the so-called Peace of Nicias. But this was only a truce that was soon broken again. The second phase of the war began with one of Athens' most ambitious and, at the same time, most disastrous undertakings, the Sicily expedition. In 415 BC, the People's Assembly decided to send a large fleet to Sicily to attack the city of Syracuse. Many Athenians saw this as an opportunity to found a new empire in the West. But the venture ended in disaster. The Athenian fleet was destroyed, the soldiers were beaten or captured, and only a few returned. The defeat shook Athens deeply and showed how dangerous arrogance and hubris could be. After this disaster, Sparta sensed its chance. With the support of Persia, which now used the war to weaken Athens, it built up a fleet that could compete with the Athenians. The war shifted more to the sea, and Athens gradually lost control of its allies. Many cities rose up against Athenian rule, which had become unpopular due to years of tributes and harsh punishments. The last phase of the war, the so-called Deucalian or Ionian War, brought the final collapse of Athens. Sparta occupied Decelea in Attica, blocking the city's supply, while its fleet became more and more successful. Athens fell into economic distress. Internal conflicts shook the polis, and at times there was even an oligarchic overthrow that suspended democracy. Although this rule did not last long and democracy was restored, the instability further weakened the city. Athens suffered its decisive defeat in 405 BC at the Battle of Aigos-Potamoi. The Spartan fleet under Lysander surprised the Athenians and destroyed almost their entire fleet. Without ships, Athens was powerless. The following year, the city had to capitulate. The long walls were torn down, the fleet surrendered, and Sparta installed an oligarchic government that became known as the rule of the 30 tyrants. This finally broke Athenian supremacy, and Sparta was at the head of Greece for a short time. The consequences of the Peloponnesian War were devastating. Many cities lay in ruins. Trade and agriculture were weakened. Entire generations had lost their lives. The war also showed the limits of the Greek polis world. The rivalry between the city-states made it impossible to create a lasting unity. Instead of developing new perspectives together, they had exhausted and weakened each other. For Athens, the war meant the loss of its position of power, but not the loss of its cultural significance. Art, philosophy, and literature remained alive and continued to have an effect. For Sparta, on the other hand, the victory brought glory, but not lasting stability. Soon it got into conflicts itself and lost its primacy. The Peloponnesian War was therefore not a victory that produced a clear winner, but a conflict that weakened all of Greece and made it vulnerable to external powers. The historiography of Thucydides has made this war immortal. His sober, analytical account of causes, strategies, and human behavior is still considered a masterpiece of historical art today. He showed how power, fear, and ambition can steer societies and drive them to ruin. The Peloponnesian War is therefore not an episode of antiquity, but a lesson in the dynamics of politics and war that has remained relevant to the present day. When one thinks back to those years, one sees Athens, once at the height of its power, brought down by arrogance and internal crises, and Sparta, which triumphed, but soon paid the price of its own austerity and rigidity. The war destroyed the balance of the Greek world and left a power vacuum that would later be filled by new forces. In the next chapter, we turn to the further course of these developments, in which Sparta became the leading power, but was soon challenged by Thebes, and the polis world entered a new phase of uncertainty.
Chapter 14: Sparta, Thebes, and the End of the Classical Polis. After the long Peloponnesian War, Sparta seemed to be the undisputed leader of the Greek world. It had defeated Athens, destroyed the fleet, destroyed the walls, and installed an oligarchic government. But the triumph was deceptive. Sparta was never designed to exercise permanent hegemony over Greece. His rigid system, which tightly controlled his own society, proved inflexible, and the victorious role brought more problems than advantages. Soon, new forces arose, and the Greek world entered a phase of uncertainty that ushered in the end of the classical polis. After 404 BC, Sparta had tried to secure its power by establishing garrisons and installing loyal oligarchies in other cities. These so-called decarchies were intended to consolidate the influence of the Spartans. But the harshness with which Sparta asserted its supremacy quickly led to resistance. Many Greeks perceived the Spartan rule as oppression, and only a few years after the victory over Athens, the first resistance arose.
And Athens itself, the rule of the 30 tyrants was soon overthrown, democracy was restored, and other cities increasingly eluded Spartan control. A decisive turning point came with the Corinthian War, 395–387 BC, in which a coalition of Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and Argos allied itself against Sparta. Paradoxically, they were supported by Persia, which had an interest in weakening Sparta. The war was changeable, but it clearly showed that Sparta was unable to maintain its hegemony without constant military force. In the end, the so-called royal peace was concluded, mediated by Persia. The Greeks had to acknowledge that the cities of Asia Minor remained under Persian control, while the other poli retained their autonomy. For the Greeks, it was painful proof that their inner turmoil made them dependent on the outside. In this situation, a new force emerged, Thebes. The Boeotian city, which had long been overshadowed by Athens and Sparta, developed into a serious rival in the 4th century BC. Their leaders, especially Epaminondas and Pelopidas, reformed the military and created new tactics that challenged previous Spartan domination. In particular, the Theban phalanx, a deeply staggered order of battle, and the elite unit of the Holy Ribbon, consisting of 150 pairs of lovers who swore never to leave each other, made Thebes a military great power. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC. Here the Theban army under Epaminondas met the Spartans, who had seemed invincible until then. With his innovative tactics, a strong concentration of troops on the left wing, Epaminondas succeeded in breaking through the Spartan phalanx. The Spartan king Cleobratus fell, and Sparta's reputation was severely shaken. For the first time, Sparta had lost a decisive land battle. The defeat of Leuctra marked the end of the Spartan domination that had been so unshakable after the Peloponnesian War. In the following years, Thebes rose to become the leading power in Greece. Epaminondas led campaigns as far as the Peloponnese, liberated Mycenae, which had been subjugated by the Spartans for centuries, and founded a new capital there, Mycenae. This was a major blow to Sparta, as it lost much of its dependent helots, which formed the basis of its economy. Thebes also built Megalopolis as a counterweight to Sparta in Arcadia, thus securing its position in the Peloponnese. But the Theban hegemony didn't last either. Epaminondas fell in 362 BC at the Battle of Mycenae, and with him, Thebes lost his greatest leader. Although the city remained an important factor for a while, it was not able to consolidate its supremacy in the long term. The constant change of centers of power, Athens, Sparta, Thebes, showed the deep fragmentation of the Greek world. No polis was able to establish lasting unity, and the rivalries weakened all involved. During this time, Athens also experienced a certain comeback. The city succeeded in founding a second Sea League organization, the so-called Second Attic Sea League. But this alliance was also marked by tensions, and Athens was unable to regain its former position of power. It was an era in which the great polis stalked each other, entered into changing alliances, waged wars, and exhausted themselves more and more. The decline of the classical polis had several causes. On the one hand, the constant rivalry between the city-states was an insurmountable obstacle. Instead of creating a lasting political unity, the polis jealously defended their autonomy, even if it meant weakness. On the other hand, social structures changed. Many citizens lost their livelihoods as a result of the wars, while mercenary armies became increasingly important. The ideals of the citizen soldiers who fought for their polis receded into the background. Finally, the external threat also played a role. Persia remained a power factor, cleverly exploiting Greek fragmentation by supporting changing parties. Thus, the classical epoch of Greece ended not with a great triumph, but with a gradual decline. Sparta was broken, Thebes couldn't hold on, Athens remained culturally significant but politically limited. The stage was set for a new power rising from the north, Macedonia. Under Philip II, and later under his son Alexander the Great, it was to succeed what the classical polis never succeeded in: the creation of a unity that reached far beyond Greece. In retrospect, This period shows the tragedy of the polis world. The Greeks had created a culture of unparalleled radiance. Their democracy, their art, their philosophy, and their science influenced the whole world. But their political fragmentation prevented them from securing this culture politically. The constant competition between Athens, Sparta, and Thebes made them victims of their own strength. In the end, it was not unity but exhaustion that opened a new chapter in the history of the Mediterranean. In the next chapter, we turn to the rise of Macedonia, whose kings Philip II and Alexander the Great steered world history in a completely new direction.
Chapter 15. Rise of Macedonia, Philip II and the Hegemony. While the large Greek city-states exhausted themselves in the constant struggle for power and supremacy, a new force matured in the north that was soon to determine the fate of Greece. Macedonia, long despised by the Hellenes and regarded as a semi-barbaric periphery, developed into a military and political great power under the reign of Philip II. What Athens, Sparta, and Thebes failed to do for centuries, namely the permanent unification of Greece, Philip was to achieve in an astonishingly short time. Macedonia was a border region geographically and culturally. It was located north of the classical polis world, characterized by mountains and fertile plains, and its kings came from an ancient ruling family that traced its ancestry back to Pericles. In contrast to the city-states of Greece, Macedonia was a kingdom with a strong monarchical tradition. But until the 4th century, it was politically rather weak, marked by internal disputes and external threats from Illyrian and Thracian tribes. It was not until Philip II, who ascended the throne in 359 BC, that he fundamentally changed the fate of his country. Philip was not only a skillful politician, but also a gifted military reformer. Already in his youth, he had lived as a hostage in Thebes, and there he had become acquainted with the art of war, especially the tactics of the Epaminondas. He used this experience to modernize the Macedonian army. He introduced the famous Macedonian phalanx, whose soldiers were equipped with particularly long lances, the sarusses. This formation was staggered lower and could develop a tremendous impact in battle. In addition, there was a well-trained cavalry and the consistent use of siege engines, which made Macedonia a military superpower. But Philip was not only a soldier, he was also a diplomat. He knew how to strengthen his position through marriage alliances, intrigues, and clever politics. Again and again he intervened in the internal affairs of the Greek polis, supported certain parties, and used the rivalries between Athens, Sparta, and Thebes to his advantage. His goal was clear: hegemony over Greece. An important step was control of the rich silver and gold mines of Amphipolis and other regions, which provided Philip with enormous financial resources. With this wealth, he was able to maintain his army permanently, recruit mercenaries, and at the same time distribute generous gifts to allies. This gave him not only military, but also economic and political strength. The Greeks initially reacted with skepticism, later with growing concern to the rise of Macedonia. Athens in particular saw Philip as a threat. In his famous Philippica speeches, the orator Demosthenes urgently warned against the Macedonian king and called on the Athenians to defend themselves. But Athens was weakened, internally divided, and incapable of pursuing a decisive policy. Other polis could not agree either, so Philip expanded his position step by step. A decisive moment came in 338 BC at the Battle of Chaeronea. There, the Macedonian army under Philip and his son Alexander, who made his first military appearance here, met the combined troops of Athens and Thebes. The battle ended with a clear victory for the Macedonians. Thebes' elite unit, the Holy Ribbon, was destroyed, and Athens had to bow to Macedonian domination. With Chaeronea, the independence of the classic polis was finally broken. After the victory, Philip founded the Corinthian League, an alliance of Greek states under his leadership.
Officially, it was an alliance that united all polis, with the exception of Sparta, to wage a new war against Persia. In truth, it was the instrument with which Philip secured his hegemony over Greece. Although the polis formally retained their autonomy, all important decisions were steered in Philip's interest. In doing so, he had achieved what had seemed unimaginable generations earlier, the unification of Greece under a single leadership. Philip's plans, however, extended far beyond Greece. His gaze was directed to the east, to the mighty Persian Empire, which was showing internal weaknesses after centuries of strength. With the legitimacy of the Corinthian League, Philip prepared a campaign that was to unite the Greeks for the first time in a joint offensive against the old archenemy. But these plans were not carried out. In 336 BC, Philip was murdered by a bodyguard during a celebration in Aigai. The background to this attack is still disputed today. Some suspect personal motives, others see intrigues at court. The only thing that is certain is that his death handed over power to his son Alexander, who was only 20 years old. Philip II had changed the face of Greece in just under a quarter of a century. From an inconspicuous peripheral kingdom, he had created a military superpower capable of uniting the fragmented Greek world. His genius lay not only in his military reforms, but also in his political skills. He exploited the weaknesses of the polis without completely destroying them, thus creating a structure that paved the way for his successor Alexander. The rise of Macedonia was also the end of the classical polis world. The proud city-states which had fought against each other for centuries lost their independence and had to fit into a larger political entity. Many Greeks saw this as a loss, others saw it as an opportunity to become part of a new order that opened up wider horizons. Philip II thus remains a key figure in Greek history. He was the one who laid the foundation for the age of his son Alexander, who was soon to break the boundaries of the known world. His name is inextricably linked with the transition from the classical period to Hellenism. In the next chapter, we turn to his son Alexander, whose conquests changed world history, and who carried the image of ancient Greece far beyond its borders. Chapter 16. Alexander the Great, Conqueror of the World. When Philip II was assassinated in 336 BC, his son Alexander took over the reign. He was barely 20 years old, and many doubted whether such a young man could direct the fate of Macedonia and Greece. But Alexander was to prove to be one of the greatest generals in history. In little more than a decade, he conquered an empire that stretched from Greece to Egypt to India, leaving behind a legacy that had an impact far beyond his lifetime. Alexander was not a blank slate when he ascended the throne. Even in his youth, he had attracted attention as exceptionally talented. His teacher was none other than Aristotle, who taught him philosophy, science, and literature. At the same time, he received extensive military training and showed courage and leadership at an early age. He had already fought at his father's side in the Battle of Chaeronea and proved that he had what it takes to be a general. After Philip's death, Alexander first had to secure his rule. In Greece, some cities rose up against Macedonian domination, including Thebes. Alexander reacted with brutal determination. He marched swiftly south and almost completely destroyed Thebes in 335 BC. The city was razed to the ground, its inhabitants enslaved or killed. This harshness was a warning to all other poli. Resistance against Macedonia was futile. Athens, which had also become restless, then complied. In this way, Alexander had secured his base and was able to turn to the greater goal, the war against Persia. In 334 BC, the Great Campaign began. With an army of about 40,000 men, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor. Right at the beginning, he won a victory in the Battle of Granicus, where he defeated the Persian satraps and thus opened the gates to Asia Minor. From there, he moved on and liberated one city after another, some of which defected to him voluntarily, some of which were subjugated after fighting. Especially the Greek cities on the coast of Asia Minor often received him as a liberator. The decisive clash with the Persian king Darius III took place in 333 BC at Issos. Despite numerical superiority, the Persian army was defeated, and Darius fled the battlefield. Alexander captured the royal camp and even captured Darius's family, whom he treated with respect. The victory made Alexander the undisputed ruler of Asia Minor and opened the way to Syria and Egypt. The campaign to the south took him to Tyre, which he conquered after a siege that lasted for months, and on to Egypt. There he was received like a liberator, as the Egyptians abhorred the Persian rule. In Memphis, he had himself crowned pharaoh and founded the city of Alexandria, which was soon to become one of the most important centers of antiquity. A visit to the famous Oracle of Siwa, where he was confirmed as the son of Zeus Ammon, strengthened his belief in a divine mission. From Egypt, Alexander moved east to defeat Persia once and for all. The decisive battle took place in 331 BC at Gaugamela. Again, he faced a huge Persian army, but his superior tactics and the discipline of his troops decided the battle. Darius fled again, and Alexander moved into Babylon, Susa, and finally Persepolis, the magnificent centers of the Persian Empire. Persepolis was sacked and set on fire, ostensibly as revenge for the destruction of Athens by Xerxes, but possibly also as a symbolic act of destroying the old empire. With the fall of these cities, the Persian Empire was practically defeated. Darius was later murdered by one of his satraps, and Alexander assumed the title King of Asia. But Alexander was not satisfied. His ambition drove him further east. He moved via present-day Afghanistan to India, where he fought against the Indian king Poros on the Hydaspes River in 326 BC. The battle was fierce, but Alexander won and showed himself generous to the defeated Poros by leaving him as governor. But his soldiers were exhausted. After years of uninterrupted campaigns, they refused to advance further into unknown India. Alexander had to turn back and started the long march back. The way back through the Gedrosian desert was one of the hardest sections of the campaign. Many men died of thirst, hunger, and exhaustion. Nevertheless, Alexander returned to Babylon with a considerable part of his army, which he made his residence. There he began to organize his empire, which now had enormous dimensions. Alexander tried to connect the cultures of the West and the East. He adopted Persian dress and court rituals, married the Persian princess Roxanne, and encouraged his officers to marry local women as well. He appointed Persians to high administrative officers and strove for a fusion of cultures. However, this also led to tensions with his Macedonian companions, who wanted to maintain the strict separation between Greeks and barbarians. But Alexander no longer had time to fully implement his plans. He died in Babylon in 323 BC, only 32 years old. The cause of his death is still unclear today. Perhaps an illness, perhaps poisoning. His sudden death left a power vacuum because he had no adult heir. His empire soon fell under his generals, the so-called Diadochi, who divided it among themselves. Despite his early death, Alexander left behind a legacy that changed the world. He had created the greatest empire of his time, he had carried Greek culture far beyond its previous borders, and he had ushered in an epoch that we now call Hellenism. His victories made him a myth, and even during his lifetime, he was considered invincible, a man with a divine mission. He became a model for many later rulers, from the Romans to medieval kings. Alexander the Great embodied the combination of insatiable ambition, military genius, and the will to shape culture. In his short life, he crossed all the borders that had existed until then and created a new world order. His name is still synonymous with conquest and greatness, and his empire, even if it fell apart, shaped the history of the Mediterranean and the Middle East for centuries. In the next chapter, we turn to the Hellenistic empires that emerged after his death, in which Greek and Eastern traditions combined to form a new culture.
Chapter 17. Hellenistic Empires, Culture in the East and West.
When Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BC, he left behind a vast empire that stretched from Greece to the borders of India. But he had not appointed a clear successor, and so a power struggle immediately broke out between his generals, the so-called Diadochi. These battles led to the empire disintegrating into several parts, which developed into independent kingdoms in the following centuries. Despite all the political fragmentation, this was the beginning of a new epoch called Hellenism. During this time, Greek and Oriental traditions combined to form a unique mixed culture that radiated far beyond the borders of Greece proper. The most important empires that emerged from Alexander's legacy were the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in the Near East, and the Antigonid Empire in Macedonia. Each of these empires had its own peculiarities, but they were all influenced by Greek culture and ways of life. Greek became the common language of trade, science, and administration. Cities such as Alexandria, Antioch, and Pergamon became the centers of a new world in which people from the most diverse backgrounds met. In Egypt, Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals, founded the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled for almost 300 years. The capital, Alexandria, quickly developed into a world-class metropolis. This is where the famous library was built, which is said to have housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls and was considered the largest center of knowledge in antiquity. Scientists such as Euclid, the founder of geometry, and Aristophanes, who calculated the circumference of the Earth with astonishing accuracy, worked here. The museum, a kind of research institute, brought together scholars from all over the world. Alexandria was not only a place of knowledge, but also a center of trade, as its port connected the Mediterranean with the Red Sea, and thus with India and Africa. The Seleucid Empire, which stretched from Syria deep into Persia, was the largest of the Hellenistic kingdoms. Its rulers had the difficult task of ruling an empire that consisted of a wide variety of peoples. Greeks, Persians, Babylonians, Jews, and many others lived under their rule. Seleucus I, the founder of the empire, tried to create bonds by founding new cities based on the Greek model. Antioch on the Orontes became the most important capital and a center of Greek culture in the East. But the vastness of the empire made it difficult to remain stable in the long term, and so there were always splits and internal struggles. The Antigonid Empire in Macedonia and Greece was the smallest, but nevertheless important part. It was here that the memory of Alexander remained particularly vivid, and it was from here that the Macedonian kings continued to influence Greek politics. They were in constant competition with the other Hellenistic empires, and at the same time had to suppress the independence efforts of the Greek polis who had not completely forgotten their old freedom. Characteristic of all Hellenistic empires was the founding of new cities. Alexander himself had founded numerous cities that bore the name Alexandria, and his successors continued this tradition. These cities were centers of Greek culture in foreign lands. They had theaters, gymnasiums, and temples built on the Greek model and attracted settlers from Greece. This created a dense network of Hellenistic cities that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus. The culture of this era was characterized by a new expansiveness. While classical Greek art and literature were strongly associated with the polis, Hellenistic culture opened up to a larger world. In art, this is reflected in a new emotionality and diversity. Statues such as the Laocoon group or the Nike of Samothrace expressed passion, pain, and movement. Painting and mosaic art reached a new level of detail, and works of art for private homes also became more important in everyday life. The literature also changed. Poets such as Callimachus in Alexandria turned away from the great epics and created ornate, shorter poems intended for an educated elite. At the same time, Theocritus gave rise to bucolic, a form of poetry that idealized the simple life of shepherds. Tragedy lost its importance, while comedy found new themes and depicted everyday life. Philosophy also continued to develop. After Alexander's death, many people were looking for orientation in a world that had become uncertain. Two major currents emerged, Stoicism and Epicureanism. Stoicism, founded by Zeno, taught that man should live in harmony with reason and nature, and that he could gain inner freedom through self-control and serenity. Epicureanism, on the other hand, named after Epicurus, emphasized the search for happiness in moderation, in friendship, and in retreat from the turmoil of public life. Both directions offered answers to the questions of a world in which the old order of the polis had been broken. However, Hellenism was not only a cultural but also an economic epoch. Trade flourished like never before. Goods from India, such as spices and precious stones, reached the Mediterranean world via the trade routes. Egypt exported grain that supplied entire regions, and the ports of Syria connected the Mediterranean world with Mesopotamia. The common language, Koine Greek, facilitated exchanges and made the Mediterranean region a cohesive cultural and economic area. Despite this flourishing, Hellenism was marked by political tensions. The Diadochi kingdoms fought numerous wars against one another, and no power could gain lasting supremacy. At the same time, peoples rose again and again on the margins, and in the West a new power grew up with Rome, which was soon to intervene in the affairs of the Greeks. But Hellenism remained formative for several centuries, and its culture left traces that still have an effect today. Hellenism was thus an epoch of transition. It connected the world of the classical polis with the world of the great empires. He opened Greek culture to the East and created a synthesis that opened up new horizons in science, art, and philosophy. From Alexandria to Bactria, people lived in cities that were Greek-influenced, and at the same time, new hybrid forms emerged that enriched thought and life. In retrospect, Hellenism appears as a time of diversity and expansion. The ideas of Greece had made the leap out of the narrow world of polis and became a universal culture that lasted for centuries. In the next chapter, we turn to everyday life in Hellenism, which was characterized by trade, education, and a new urban way of life.
Chapter 18. Everyday Life in Hellenism. Cities, Commerce, Education. With the beginning of Hellenism, not only the political map changed, but also the everyday life of the people. The world had become bigger, the horizons wider, and life in the cities was very different from what was known from the classical era. While the polis had been the center of all activities in classical Greece, a world now emerged in which large cities, international trade networks, and new educational institutions shaped everyday life. The Hellenistic cities were at the heart of this development. Everywhere in the Eastern Mediterranean and far into Asia, the kings founded new cities or expanded existing ones. Alexandria in Egypt was the most significant example. A city with wide streets, magnificent temples, a huge harbor, and the famous library that attracted people from all over the world. But Antioch in Syria, Pergamon in Asia Minor, or Seleucia on the Tigris were also centers that shaped the character of the time. These cities were no longer small civic communities like the old polis, but metropolises that could accommodate hundreds of thousands of people and were the melting pots of different cultures. In these cities, trade played a central role. Hellenism was an era of economic boom in which goods were transported over long distances. Egypt supplied grain, Syria wine and oil, India spices, precious stones, and cotton, while horses and other goods came from Central Asia. Via the Mediterranean and the newly developed trade routes in the East, these goods reached the most remote regions. Markets were full of exotic products that would have been hard to imagine in the past. Traders, boatmen, and merchants gained influence, and prosperity was increasingly concentrated in the big cities. Everyday life in the Hellenistic cities was characterized by a variety of people and ways of life. Greeks lived alongside Egyptians, Syrians, Persians, and Jews, and this mix led to a cultural penetration that made Hellenism so unique. Theatrical performances, religious festivals, high schools, and philosophical schools were part of urban life, while temples were dedicated to the gods of various traditions. It was a cosmopolitan world in which identity was no longer determined exclusively by belonging to a polis, but by the place one occupied in this vast world. The gymnasium, originally a place of physical exercise in the classical polis, now became a center of education.
Here, young men learned not only sports, but also literature, philosophy, mathematics, and rhetoric. Education was the most important instrument of social recognition, and those who spoke Greek and had enjoyed Greek education could make a career in administration or commerce. Koine Greek, the unified form of the language, became the lingua franca of the entire Eastern Mediterranean, similar to Latin later in the Roman Empire or English in the modern world. Women had more opportunities in some areas of Hellenistic life than before, especially in Egypt, where ancient traditions allowed for a certain position for women. They were able to inherit and administer property, be active in religious institutions, and in individual cases, even gain political power. The most famous example is Cleopatra VII, the last Ptolemaic woman who made history centuries later as Queen of Egypt. But for most women, life remained focused on family and home, even though the cultural mix in some regions led to more freedom. Religion still played a major role, but it changed in Hellenism. The old gods of Greece continued to be worshipped, but they entered new contexts. In many cities, cults arose that combined Greek and Eastern traditions. The cult of the Egyptian god Serapis is an example of this synthesis. At the same time, mystery cults that promised believers personal salvation and immortality gained an importance, such as the cults of Isis or Dionysus. These new religious currents reflected people's need for orientation in a larger, often anonymous world. But everyday life was not only characterized by glamour. In addition to the wealthy merchants and officials, there lived a large number of simple people who sought their livelihood in crafts, agriculture, or as day laborers. Poverty was widespread, and the contrasts between wealth and misery were more evident than in the old polis. Mercenary armies moved through the countries, and political uncertainties repeatedly led to unrest. Life was more diverse, but also more unpredictable. During this time, the sciences flourished like never before. Scholars worked in Alexandria who gained groundbreaking insights. Euclid systematically summarized geometry. Archimedes developed new mathematical methods and technical inventions. Aristarchus of Samos put forth the bold thesis that the Earth moves around the sun. Medicine, astronomy, and mechanics were making enormous advances, and the Library of Alexandria was the symbol of this wealth of knowledge. Education and research were no longer just part of philosophy, but disciplines in their own right, which became increasingly specialized. Public life also changed. In the big cities, there were magnificent theaters where comedies and tragedies were performed, and libraries that collected knowledge. The architecture showed the wealth of the kings, who demonstrated their power through buildings such as the Lighthouse of Alexandria or the Altar of Pergamon. At the same time, public squares were created where people met, discussed, and traded. City life was more intense and diverse than ever before. Hellenism brought about a new way of life that was fundamentally different from the classical polis. The citizen, who had previously been mainly a member of a small community, now became part of a larger cosmopolitan world. Identity was no longer defined solely by belonging to a city, but by language, education, and participation in a common culture. In retrospect, everyday life in Hellenism shows the ambivalence of this epoch. On the one hand, there was wealth, education, cultural diversity, and scientific progress, and on the other, insecurity, social inequality, and the danger of political conflicts. But it was precisely in this mixture that a world emerged that laid the foundation for the Roman Empire and shaped the history of the Mediterranean region for centuries. In the next chapter, we turn to Greece under Roman rule and look at how the polis world was integrated into the powerful empire and what place Greek culture found in this new order.
Chapter 19. Greece under Roman Rule. When the Hellenistic epoch had passed its peak, a new power began to rise in the West, which was soon to determine the fate of the entire Mediterranean world. Rome, originally a city on the Tiber, had brought Italy under its control through disciplined warfare, a well-developed alliance system, and political flexibility. From there, it expanded its rule step by step, and by the time of the Punic Wars against Carthage at the latest, it was clear that Rome had become the decisive power of the Mediterranean.
For Greece, this meant the beginning of a new epoch in which the polis world finally lost its political independence, but its culture became a formative part of the Roman Empire. The first direct contacts between Greeks and Romans were initially diplomatic in nature, but they soon came into conflict. When Rome expanded its power eastwards in the 3rd century BC, it inevitably came up against the Hellenistic empires. The Kingdom of Macedonia in particular played a key role in this. The Macedonian king Philip V had concluded an alliance with Hannibal during the Second Punic War, which Rome perceived as a threat. This was followed by the Macedonian Wars, in which Rome gradually gained a foothold in Greece. In 197 BC, the Romans defeated Philip V at Cynoscaphalae. Although they solemnly declared the freedom of the Greeks afterwards, this freedom was more appearance than reality. Rome became increasingly involved in the internal affairs of the polis, using their rivalries to gain influence. The defeat of the Seleucid king Antiochus III at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC further weakened the Eastern powers and finally made Rome the dominant force. The decisive turning point came with the Third Macedonian War. King Perseus, the son of Philip V, tried to preserve Macedonia's independence, but in 168 BC he was defeated at Pydna. The Macedonian kingdom was dissolved and cut into 4 parts, which Rome controlled. A few years later, the city of Corinth rose up against the Romans, but in 146 BC it was destroyed, and Greece officially became a Roman province called Achaia. From then on, the independence of the polis was finally history. Under Roman rule, life in Greece changed profoundly. Politically, the cities lost their independence, but many of their institutions remained. The Romans knew how to use traditional structures to secure their rule. Thus, the polis were allowed to continue to manage their local affairs as long as they remained loyal to Rome and paid taxes. Athens, for example, retained its cultural significance even though it no longer had any political power. Greek culture experienced an astonishing flourishing under the Romans. Rome was the new ruler, but the Romans saw Greek culture as a model and admired its art, philosophy, and science. Many young Romans came to Athens or Rhodes to study rhetoric and philosophy. Rich Romans collected Greek works of art, built villas with statues and mosaics, and were served by Greek architects and craftsmen. The Roman poet Horace spoke of Greece, which, defeated its wild victor. By this he meant that Rome dominated militarily, but was intellectually shaped by Greece. Philosophy and education remained central elements. Schools of Stoicism and Epicureanism flourished, and new currents such as skepticism found followers. Athens remained an intellectual center where philosophers, rhetors, and teachers continued the tradition. At the same time, the Greek language gained the rank of a cultural language in the east of the empire, which shaped administration and science. While Latin was the language of Roman power, Greek remained the language of thought and learning. The everyday life of the Greeks under Roman rule was characterized by adaptation and continuity. Traders benefited from the stable conditions in the Roman Empire, which guaranteed safe roads and trade routes. Products from Greece, olive oil, wine, handicrafts, found new markets. Cities such as Corinth, which was rebuilt after its destruction, or Thessalonica developed into important trading centers. At the same time, social differences became more pronounced. The Roman administration produced new elites who rose through loyalty to Rome. Local aristocrats who served the Romans were able to amass great wealth, while simple farmers and artisans often benefited little. The old civic community of the polis lost its importance, and many people felt the political incapacitation as a loss. Religiously, Greece remained diverse. The old cults continued to be cultivated, but at the same time, new currents were introduced. Roman gods were identified with Greek ones, Zeus with Jupiter, Aphrodite with Venus, Hermes with Mercury. At the same time, mystery cults continued to gain an importance, and in some regions, Eastern religions that promised personal salvation also spread. In this atmosphere, Christianity later also found fertile ground. Militarily, Greece played only a subordinate role in the Roman Empire. The polis no longer provided their own armies, but were protected and controlled by Roman legions. The Greeks were now part of a great empire that brought peace and order, but also restricted freedom and independence. In retrospect, Greece under Roman rule shows a double development. Politically, it was a subjugated country that had lost its independence. Culturally, however, it shaped the winner. The philosophy, art, literature, and science of Greece became the foundations of the Roman world, and thus of the entire European tradition. Rome took over the external power, Greece gave the spiritual content. This connection made antiquity a unity of Roman power and the Greek spirit. Without Greece, Rome would have been culturally poorer. Without Rome, Greece would have become politically insignificant. Together, however, they created a civilization whose influence continues to this day. In the next chapter, we'll look at the legacy of ancient Greece and look at how its ideas, arts, and institutions continue to have an impact over thousands of years, laying the foundation of our modern world.
Chapter 20. Legacy of Ancient Greece, from Antiquity to the Present Day. Ancient Greece is long gone, but its legacy lives on in many forms. Hardly any other culture has had such a lasting impact on the development of Europe as this community of city-states that once lived between mountains and seas. The ideas, institutions, works of art, and discoveries of the Greeks have had an impact over thousands of years, have been carried on, changed, and reinterpreted so that they can still be felt today. The political idea of democracy is perhaps the most well-known legacy. In Athens, a system developed in the 5th century BC that gave citizens a say and participation. Although this democracy was limited, women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded, the basic idea that the people could determine themselves became one of the most powerful ideas in human history. Later centuries drew on it, from the Roman republicans to the thinkers of the Enlightenment to modern democracies. Philosophy was no less important. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle asked questions that are still relevant today. What is justice? What is truth? How should a person live? Their answers and methods created the foundations of Western thought. The rationalism of the Greeks, their search for reasons and causes, was a decisive step in the development of science. Logic, ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology emerged in this epoch and remained central disciplines throughout the centuries. The Greeks also laid the foundations in the natural sciences. Euclid systematized geometry. Archimedes developed mathematical methods and technical principles. Aristarchus of Samos recognized the movement of the earth around the sun. Hippocrates founded medicine as an independent science. These findings were preserved by Arab scholars in the Middle Ages and later rediscovered in the Renaissance. Without the Greeks, modern scientific progress would hardly have been conceivable. The art and architecture of Greece are also part of a lasting legacy. The temples, such as the Parthenon in Athens, embody the harmony of measure and order, which are still the model for buildings all over the world today. Columns such as Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian have been imitated in countless buildings, from the Roman Pantheon to modern parliament buildings. Sculpture reached a perfection in the representation of the human body, which showed the human being in an idealized but at the same time natural way. This conception of art shaped the Renaissance as well as the classicism of the 18th and 19th centuries. In literature, the Greeks left behind works that have never been forgotten. The epics of Homer, the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, the comedies of Aristophanes, the historiography of Herodotus and Thucydides, all these texts form the basis of the literary canon to this day. They deal with themes that are universal: heroism and guilt, power and powerlessness, love and betrayal, fate and freedom. That is why they are still read, performed, and interpreted today. Greece also continued to work in politics and the military. The polis as a form of organization was unique, and even though it perished in the Roman Empire, the idea of active citizenship remained alive. Militarily, the Greeks developed the phalanx, which remained a model for armies for centuries. Their experiences in the fight against the Persians and in the Peloponnesian War provided insights into strategy, diplomacy, and power politics that are still valid today. The heritage of religion must not be overlooked. Greek myths shaped the imagination of Europe for centuries. Zeus,
Hera, Athena, Apollo, and the other gods were not only part of religion, but also part of a cultural language that lived on in art, literature, and philosophy. Even when Christianity displaced the old gods, they remained as figures of poetry and symbols. Many idioms, images, and ideas come from this mythology to this day. The connection between Greece and Rome strengthened this heritage. Rome adopted Greek culture, made it part of its empire, and carried it to the entire Mediterranean world. Through Rome, Greek ideas entered the European tradition, survived the Middle Ages, and were revived in the Renaissance. Humanists such as Petrarch or Aristotle drew on the Greek classics, and artists such as Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci were inspired by Greek models. In modern times, ancient Greece became a symbol of freedom, reason, and beauty. The Enlightenment saw the Greeks as a model for critical thinking and political self-determination. The French Revolution invoked the ideals of Athens, the American Declaration of Independence stood in this tradition, and in the 19th century, reconstructed Greece became a symbol of national liberation. The legacy is still visible today. Traces of the Greeks can be found in architecture and art, in literature and theater, in politics and philosophy. The Olympic Games, which originated in Athens, are a worldwide event. Terms such as democracy, politics, philosophy, theater, or history come from Greek. The foundations of mathematics, medicine, and physics taught in school go back to Greek thinkers. So, Greece's legacy is not only historical, but alive. It shows how a small world of city-states produced ideas that outgrew their time. It teaches that human curiosity, the courage to think, and the will to freedom are forces that can work for thousands of years. Thus, the history of ancient Greece does not end with the loss of its political independence, but lives on in everything that shapes our world. The Greeks have given humanity a foundation that is constantly discovered, questioned, and further developed. Their legacy is not complete, but remains part of a living tradition that combines the present with the past.